The all moved with a slow, practiced rhythm, a patient punctuation against the silence of the afternoon. Elias worked the leather in the sliver of shade offered by the lean-to, his knuckles scarred and brown from sun and tallow, his movements economical and sure. The air was thick with the smell of dust and curing hide, and the dry, peppery scent of the sagebrush that clung to the edges of his small outpost, a solitary island of corrals and packed earth in a sea of shimmering heat. He was stitching a new cantle onto a worn-out stock saddle, the thread waxed with beeswax from his own hives, each pulled tight and even, a testament to a belief that things should be made to last, because in this country, what didn't last was quickly turned to bone and memory. The world beyond his small circle of work was a vast, indifferent canvas of bleached sky and ochre dirt, a place that rewarded stillness and punished haste, and he had learned its lessons well, learned to measure his days not in hours but in the slow creep of shadows across the yard. A horse stamped in the corral, a fly buzzed against the hot tin of the roof, and the needle rose and fell. It was a good life for a man who preferred the company of his own thoughts, a life pared down to the essentials of water and work and the quiet satisfaction of a seam well sewn. He was not lonely. He was merely alone. Then, a change in the air, a subtle vibration in the hard-packed ground before the sound reached him. He paused, his hand hovering over the leather, his head cocked to the east. He listened past the wind, past the drone of insects, and heard it. The rhythmic, percussive beat of shod hooves on dry earth, too many for a lone rider, too steady for a stray herd. Dust, a faint plume on the horizon, rose like smoke from a distant fire, growing taller and thicker as it drew nearer, a smudge of motion against the unblinking blue. He set his awl down with deliberate care, wiped his palms on his canvas apron, and rose, his joints protesting with a dry crackle. Strangers were not an anomaly, but they were an event, a disruption to the steady cadence of his life, and he watched their approach with a neutral, waiting stillness that was his default state. There were 4 of them, their shapes slowly resolving out of the heat haze, dark figures on dark horses, moving with the weary confidence of men who had been long in the saddle. They rode not like ranchers or prospectors, but with a kind of ragged military discipline, a formation that spoke of purpose and hierarchy. The man in the lead was tall and thin, riding a fine-boned gray that looked ill-suited to the terrain, its coat dark with sweat. The other 2 fanned out slightly behind him, their faces obscured by dust and the brims of their hats. And trailing just behind the leader, led by a rope, was a 5th horse, a scrawny buckskin, and on it a 5th rider whose form was small and indistinct, almost an afterthought. They pulled up before the lean-to, the sudden cessation of movement kicking up a final cloud of dust that settled slowly over everything, coating the water trough and the woodpile, and Elias himself in a fine, gritty film. The horses blew and stamped, their sides heaving. The lead rider dismounted, his movements stiff but precise, and ran a gloved hand over his gray's neck. He was a man made of sharp angles, with a narrow face and eyes so pale they seemed colorless in the glare. He surveyed the outpost, his gaze flicking over the tidy workshop, the mended fence posts, the stacked firewood, and finally settling on Elias. "You the smith?" he asked, his voice flat and dry as the dust his arrival had stirred. Elias gave a slow nod. "I work leather, some metal if it's simple." The man grunted, a sound of minimal acknowledgement. "Got a saddle needs seeing to. The cinch strap's tearing loose from the tree. Needs to be reseated. Can you do it?" He gestured to one of his men, who began uncinching the saddle from his own mount, a big, clumsy roan. It was a heavy, ornate piece of work, studded with silver conchos that were tarnished and dull. Elias walked over, running his thumb over the cracked leather near the rigging plate. The stitching was rotten, the leather itself brittle from sun and neglect. It was poor care, not poor craftsmanship. "I can fix it," Elias said. "It will take time. The whole rigging needs to be pulled off and restitched." The man's thin lips tightened. "How much time?" "The rest of today. I'll have it by morning." The man considered this, his pale eyes unblinking. "Fine. We'll camp by the creek. We need water and grain." "I have grain," Elias said. "Water's from the well. You can have what you need." He looked past the leader to the figure on the buckskin, who had not moved or spoken, a slump of faded cloth in the harsh sunlight. A length of dirty blonde hair escaped from under a battered hat, but the face was turned away, shadowed and unreadable. "Your whole party will need water, I expect," Elias said, his gaze lingering on the fifth rider. The leader followed his look, and a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or possessive pride, crossed his face. "She's fine." He turned to his men. "See to the horses. Unpack what we need." Then he looked back at Elias, who was still looking at the silent figure. An uncomfortable silence stretched, thickened by the heat. Elias felt a small, unfamiliar urge to push against the man's dismissive tone, to acknowledge the humanity of the person being ignored. It was a foolish impulse. It was not his business. "What's her name?" Elias asked, the words out before he could stop them. The question was simple, direct, and in the weighted silence of the yard, it landed with the force of a stone dropped in a still pond. The leader's eyes narrowed. He looked from Elias to the girl and back again, a thin, cold smile touching his lips. It was not a smile of humor. "She isn't worth introducing," he said, and the words were not a judgment, but a statement of fact, a closing of a door. He turned his back then, a clear dismissal, and began issuing orders to his men, his voice carrying easily in the quiet air, leaving Elias standing in the dust with the broken saddle at his feet and a sense of profound unease settling in his gut. The girl had not moved. She had not looked at him. She was a ghost at the edge of the scene, present but unacknowledged, and the leader's words hung in the air between them, more brutal than a physical blow. A thing not worth a name. Afternoon. The heat pressed down, a physical weight on the shoulders, silencing the birds and baking the very color from the sky. Finch, Elias had heard one of the other men use the name, sat on an overturned bucket in the shade of the stable wall, sharpening a long-bladed knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a grating counterpoint to the quiet hum of the day. His men, whose names Elias had not bothered to learn, had watered the horses and were now engaged in a listless game of cards, their voices a low murmur of curses and grumbled wagers. They had built a small fire, despite the heat, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon mingled with the scent of horse and leather. They had created their own small bubble of civilization, a temporary encampment governed by Finch's cold authority. And at its edge, just outside the circle of their attention, sat the girl. She had dismounted and now sat with her back against a corral post, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face still hidden by the brim of her hat. They had given her a tin cup of water and a piece of hard biscuit, which she had taken without a word, and consumed with a slow, mechanical deliberation that suggested a long acquaintance with hunger. No one spoke to her, no one looked at her. She was a piece of baggage, set aside until she was needed again. Elias worked, his focus narrowed to the task at hand. He had stripped the rigging from Finch's saddle, the rotten threads parting with a sad, crumbling sigh. The wooden tree was sound, but the leather that covered it was as dry as old paper, scarred and abused. He worked methodically, cutting away the ruined sections, selecting a new piece of thick skirting leather from his stores, soaking it in the trough until it was pliable. His hands moved with an ingrained intelligence, the tools becoming extensions of his will. He used a round knife to skive the edges, a creaser to burnish a neat line along the border, a mule-foot stamp to impress a simple, repeating pattern into the damp surface. It was more than was necessary for a simple repair, an embellishment the owner would likely not notice or appreciate, but it was a matter of pride. A thing worth doing was worth doing well. His craft was his creed, the only one he had left. As he worked, he was acutely aware of the scene in his yard, the small human drama playing out in the slivers of shade. He watched the girl from the corner of his eye. He saw how she tracked the movements of the men, not with fear, but with a kind of weary, detached vigilance, the way a wild thing watches the approach of predators it knows it cannot outrun. He saw that her hands, resting on her knees, were chapped and raw, but the fingers were long and slender, incongruous with the rest of her worn and ragged appearance. He would spend a long time afterward wondering why it mattered to him. He was a man who had built a life around the principle of non-interference. He fixed what was broken, sold what was needed, and asked no questions. The world was full of casual cruelty, and a man could break himself trying to mend it all. Yet, The cold, simple pronouncement, "She isn't worth introducing," had lodged in his mind like a burr under a saddle blanket, a small, persistent irritation. It was the language of the abattoir, of the branding iron, of a world that measured the value of a living thing by its use. He looked at his own hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of his life, and he knew that worth was not something given by another, but something earned, something inherent in the simple act of enduring. He saw that endurance in the rigid set of the girl's spine, in the way she conserved her every movement. She was not a broken thing. She was a thing that had been bent, but had not yet snapped. He finished shaping the new leather pieces, fitting them carefully around the saddle tree, the wet leather conforming to the contours of the wood. It would need to dry slowly, overnight, before he could stitch it all together. He stood up, stretching the stiffness from his back, and walked to the well, the bucket rattling as he lowered it into the cool darkness. He drew up a bucket of clear, cold water and drank deeply from the dipper, the water a shock of life against the heat of the day. He refilled the dipper, and on an impulse he didn't try to analyze, he walked not towards Finch or his men, but directly towards the girl. The card game faltered. The sound of the whetstone stopped. 4 pairs of eyes watched him. He stopped a few feet from her and held out the dipper. "Water," he said, his voice quiet. She did not look up at first. She remained perfectly still, as if any movement might draw a blow. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. For the first time, he saw her face clearly. She was younger than he had thought, perhaps not yet 20. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat, her lips cracked, but her eyes, when they met his, were a startlingly clear shade of blue, and in their depths was not fear, but a profound and ancient weariness. She looked at the dipper, then at his face, and for a fleeting second he saw a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. Before she could move, Finch was on his feet, his knife still in his hand. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides, his boots scuffing in the dust. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I'll see to her," he said, his voice a blade of ice. He took the dipper from Elias's hand, his fingers brushing against Elias's in a brief, cold contact. He did not give it to the girl. He drank from it himself, draining it in 2 long swallows, then casually tossed the empty dipper onto the ground beside her. It landed with a hollow clatter in the dust. "She's had her share," Finch said, turning his back on them both and walking back to his spot. The moment of tension dissolved, his ownership reasserted. He picked up his whetstone. The scraping sound began again. Elias stood there for a moment, his hand empty, the casual, deliberate cruelty of the act settling like poison in the air. He looked at the girl. She was looking at the dipper lying in the dirt. Her expression had not changed. She simply lowered her head again, hiding her face, becoming once more a nameless, shapeless bundle of cloth in the shade. He had tried. He had failed. That night. A sliver of moon hung in an ink-black sky, and the stars were a cold, indifferent scatter of diamonds. The desert had shed its heat, and a chill crept into the air, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that would never fall here. The fire of Finch's camp had burned down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers, casting a faint, flickering light on the sleeping forms of his men, rolled in their blankets. Finch himself was not asleep. He sat propped against his saddle, a dark silhouette against the dying coals, a rifle laid across his lap. He was a man who did not trust the world enough to give himself over completely to unconsciousness. Elias stood in the doorway of his small cabin, a single lamp burning behind him, casting his long shadow across the yard. He could not sleep. The saddle tree, draped in its new, damp leather, sat on his workbench, drying in the cool night air. It was a solid, tangible thing, a problem he could solve with his hands. The problem in his yard was of a different sort, a knot of human misery he had no tool to unpick. He watched the girl. They had not bothered to give her a blanket. She was huddled against the same corral post, trying to draw some warmth from the thick wood that had absorbed the day's heat. She shivered, a small, barely perceptible tremor that ran through her thin frame. Elias's cabin was small, little more than a single room with a cot, a table, and a cold stove, but it was weatherproof and warm. He had 2 thick wool blankets on his cot. The thought was a simple one, a basic human decency. But nothing about this situation was simple. To offer her a blanket would be another challenge to Finch, a more direct one than the offer of water. It would be an act of claiming, a statement that he saw her not as property, but as a person deserving of comfort. It could be seen as an invitation. It could bring violence down on them both. He stood in the doorway for a long time, the cool air raising goosebumps on his arms, caught in a rare moment of indecision. His life was built on a careful calculus of risk and reward, and the risk here was plain to see in the glint of moonlight on the rifle in Finch's lap. The reward was nothing, less than nothing. The quiet satisfaction of a decent act that no one but him and a nameless girl would ever know about. It was a poor trade. And yet, he thought of the way Finch had looked at him, the casual certainty of his power. He thought of the dipper of water tossed in the dust. He thought of a life lived so far outside the bounds of human kindness that a name was a luxury she could not be afforded. He turned back into the cabin, took one of the blankets from his cot, a heavy gray wool, worn but clean, and folded it over his arm. He walked out of the cabin, not toward the dying fire, but along the edge of the yard, using the shadows of the stable and the water trough to mask his approach. Finch did not move, his attention seemingly fixed on the darkness beyond the camp. Elias moved slowly, his worn boots making almost no sound on the packed earth. He reached the corral where the girl was huddled. She heard him, her head snapping up, her body tensing like a spooked horse. In the faint starlight, he could see the whites of her eyes. He stopped and held out the blanket. He said nothing. He simply offered it. She stared at it, then at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and deep, ingrained suspicion. She had been taught, probably by the hardest of lessons, that no hand was ever extended to her without a price attached. He did not move closer. He simply stood there, waiting, letting her make the choice. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then, with a slow, hesitant movement, she reached out and her small, chapped fingers brushed against the wool. She took it from him, her touch as light as a moth's wing. She drew it around her shoulders, pulling it tight, and the violent shivering that had racked her body began to subside. She looked up at him one last time, a long, unreadable look, and then she turned her head away, a small, private dismissal. He had been acknowledged. He had been permitted. He retreated back into the shadows as silently as he had come. From his doorway, he saw Finch shift his position by the fire, but the man gave no sign that he had seen anything. The girl, wrapped in the gray wool blanket, was a slightly larger, slightly less fragile shadow by the corral. It was not a victory. It was not a solution, but it was something. It was a single stitch in a tear that seemed impossibly large, a small act of repair in a world full of things that were broken. Days later. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and dusty orange. The air was cool and clean. Elias had been up since first light, his hands already busy. The leather on the saddle tree was dry and stiff, perfectly molded to the wood. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements fluid and sure. He punched the stitching holes with a sharp awl, the small impacts a steady, rhythmic tapping in the morning stillness. He threaded 2 needles with heavy waxed linen thread and began the slow, laborious process of saddle stitching, a 2-handed technique that created a seam of incredible strength and durability. Each stitch was pulled tight, locking into the one before it, a chain of small, perfect knots buried within the leather. It was work that could not be rushed, work that demanded patience and absolute concentration. As he worked, Finch's camp came slowly to life. The men rose, grumbling and stiff, and rekindled the fire, the smell of coffee once again filling the air. They moved with the sluggishness of men who were not eager for the day ahead. Finch himself was already awake, watching Elias from across the yard, his pale eyes narrowed in appraisal. He walked over, coffee cup in hand, and stood over the workbench, inspecting the work. He ran a finger over the new leather, over the decorative stamping Elias had added. "You do good work," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a simple statement of fact, an assessment of value. "It will hold," Elias replied, not looking up from his stitching. "It better," Finch said. "It's a long way to the next man who can do this." He took a sip of his coffee. "We'll be ready to ride as soon as you're done." Elias nodded, his needle rising and falling in its steady rhythm. He could feel the impatience rolling off Finch, the desire to be gone, to be moving. But Elias would not be hurried. The work would take as long as the work took. The integrity of the seam was more important than the man's schedule. The girl was moving about the camp, her tasks small and servile. She gathered firewood, she scoured the greasy skillet with sand from the creek bed, she refilled the men's canteens from the well. She moved with a downcast gaze and a quiet efficiency that made her almost invisible. The gray blanket was gone. Elias wondered if Finch had taken it from her or if she had hidden it away, a secret piece of comfort. When she came to the well, her path took her close to his workshop. He did not stop his work, did not look up, but he spoke, his voice low, not much more than a murmur. "My name is Elias." She stopped. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, the wooden yoke of the water buckets resting on her shoulders. He could feel her surprise, her hesitation. He continued to stitch, his eyes fixed on the leather, giving her the privacy of his inattention. He was offering a piece of himself, a name, to balance the one he had asked for. It was an invitation to a conversation she was not required to join. He heard the creak of the yoke as she shifted her weight. He risked a glance. She was looking at him, her clear blue eyes wide with an emotion he could not name. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came out. One of the other men shouted something from the fire, a coarse, impatient command, and the moment was broken. She flinched, her face closing down, becoming blank and guarded once more. She turned and walked away, the buckets sloshing, leaving him with the needle in his hand and the feeling of a door having been opened a crack, only to be slammed shut again. An hour later, as the sun began to climb and the heat returned to the day, he set the final stitch. He trimmed the threads, pounded the seam flat with a smooth-faced mallet, and rubbed a coat of warm tallow and oil into the new leather, darkening it to a rich mahogany and giving it a supple, waterproof finish. The repair was done. It was stronger than the original, a neat, robust piece of craftsmanship, grafted onto the scarred and neglected hole. He carried the saddle across the yard and set it on a fence rail. "It's ready," he called out. Finch walked over, his men trailing behind him. He picked up the saddle, hefting it, inspecting Elias's work with a critical eye. He pulled at the rigging, testing the strength of the seams. He seemed satisfied. "Good," he said, turning to Elias. "What do I owe you?" Elias named a price. It was a fair price, maybe a little high, but fair for the quality of the work and the urgency of the need. Finch didn't argue. He reached into a leather pouch on his belt and counted out the coins, his movements precise and economical. He dropped the coins into Elias's outstretched palm. As Finch turned to leave, to order his men to saddle up, Elias spoke again, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the morning air. He looked directly at the girl who was standing by the horses, waiting to be told what to do. "This new leather," he said, his voice carrying so all the men could hear. "It will be stiff for a while. It will need oiling again in a week's time, and then again after the first big rain. You'll know how to do it. Use neatsfoot oil if you have it, lard if you don't." It was a simple set of instructions, the kind of advice a craftsman gives a customer. But it was addressed to her, directly to her. It assumed she would be the one to care for the saddle. It assumed she had a future that extended beyond this dusty yard, a future that included weeks and rainstorms. It acknowledged her presence, her competence, and her continued existence. It was a profound and unforgivable breach of the unspoken rules. The yard went absolutely silent. The men stopped what they were doing. Finch, who had started to walk away, stopped dead and turned around very, very slowly. His face was a mask of cold fury. The veneer of civilization, thin as it was, had cracked. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Elias did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the girl. "I said she'll know how to care for it." Finch walked back towards Elias until he was standing only an arm's length away. The man was taller than he looked, wiry and hard, and he radiated a palpable menace. "You don't talk to her," he hissed, the words of venomous spray. "You talk to me. She doesn't do anything unless I tell her to. She doesn't know anything unless I tell her what she knows." Elias finally met his gaze. His own face was calm, his hands loose at his sides. He did not feel fear. He felt a strange, cold clarity, a sense of a line having been crossed that could not be uncrossed. "She has a name," Elias said, the words simple, declarative, a statement of fact. "I asked you for it. Finch's hand moved, a blur of motion, but it was not aimed at Elias. He lunged towards the girl, his hand raised to strike. It was a punishment for her, for being the object of this insubordination. But Elias was ready. He moved with a speed that belied his deliberate nature, stepping between Finch and the girl, blocking the blow. He did not raise his own hands to fight. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable object. In his right hand, he still held the heavy, round-faced mallet he had used to finish the seam. He did not lift it as a weapon. He just held it. Its dense weight was a comforting, solid presence in his palm. The moment froze, stretched taut as a bowstring. Finch stood with his hand raised, his face contorted in a snarl of rage, his knuckles inches from Elias's chest. Elias stood impassive, his eyes steady, the mallet a dead weight in his hand. The other men watched, their card game forgotten, their faces a mixture of surprise and apprehension. They were hard men, but they were followers, and their leader's authority had just been publicly and quietly defied. They saw a man who was not afraid, and they saw the mallet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling softly around the corner of the stable. Finch's rage was pitted against Elias's stillness. Violence simmered, a breath away from boiling over. It was Finch who broke. His eyes flickered from Elias's face to the impassive faces of his men, and he saw no support there, only a sullen, waiting curiosity. To force the issue now, to fight a leather worker in his own yard over a point of pride, would make him look weak, not strong. His authority depended on a myth of absolute control. And that myth had just been punctured. With a final guttural curse, he lowered his hand. He took a step back, his face flushed with a dark, mottled anger. He pointed a trembling finger, not at Elias, but at the girl. "You want her?" he spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You can have her. She's more trouble than she's worth. Broken goods." He turned to his men. "Leave it. Let's ride." He strode to his horse, grabbed the newly repaired saddle, and threw it onto the animal's back with a grunt of effort, not waiting for help. His men, after a moment's hesitation, scrambled to follow his lead, their movements clumsy and rushed. They were eager to be away from this place, away from the uncomfortable silence and the quiet man with the mallet in his hand. Within minutes, they were mounted and ready. Finch gave one last hateful look at Elias and the girl. He spurred his horse, and the small party rode out, kicking up dust, their departure as sudden and disruptive as their arrival. They did not look back. The dust settled. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the buzzing of a fly. Elias and the girl stood in the empty yard, the space between them charged with the residue of the confrontation. He was still holding the mallet, his knuckles white. Slowly, he opened his hand and let it fall to his side. He felt a profound weariness settle over him, the draining aftermath of adrenaline. He had not sought this. He had not wanted it. He had simply followed a thread of decency to its logical, dangerous conclusion. He looked at her. She was staring after the riders, her expression unreadable. She had not been saved. She had merely been abandoned, traded from one owner to another like a lame horse. The victory, if it could be called that, was small and sour. He turned and walked back to his workshop, the tension draining out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and old. He placed the mallet back in its proper place on his workbench. He began to tidy his tools, the familiar methodical actions a comfort in the sudden ringing quiet. He did not know what to do with her. He did not know what she would do. He heard a small sound behind him and turned. She had followed him to the edge of the lean-to and was standing in the shade watching him. She was holding the gray wool blanket, which she must have hidden in her saddle roll. She held it out to him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low and husky from disuse, but it was clear. It was the first time he had heard her speak more than a single word. He shook his head. "Keep it. The nights are cold." She hesitated, then folded the blanket carefully over her arm. She stood there for a long moment, as if trying to find the words for something. He waited, giving her the time she needed. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quiet but firm, meeting his eyes for the first time without fear or weariness, but with a simple, declarative dignity. "My name," she said, "is Alara." Weeks later, the world had settled into a new rhythm. The days were still marked by the rising and setting of the sun, by the slow creep of shadows. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but the quiet of shared space. Elias worked at his bench, the familiar motions of his craft a steadying presence in his life. The scent of leather and wax still filled the air, but it was now sometimes joined by the smell of baking bread or the faint earthy scent of watered soil. Olara had found her own place in the small world of the outpost. She was a quiet presence, as economical in her speech as he was, but her actions spoke for her. She had a touch with the horses, a gentle, intuitive way of calming them that Elias had never possessed. She had discovered a small, forgotten patch of ground behind the cabin where a leaky water barrel had created a pocket of damp earth, and she had begun to cultivate it. Using a sharpened piece of scrap metal as a trowel, she had coaxed a few stubborn, wild-looking tomato plants and a patch of hardy greens from the unforgiving soil. It was a small, defiant act of creation in a landscape of decay. They rarely spoke of the day Finch had left. There was no need. It was the foundation of their new reality, the unspoken event that had bound them together in this strange, quiet partnership. He had learned things about her not through words but through observation. He learned she could stitch a tear in a shirt with thread so fine the mend was nearly invisible. He learned she knew the names of the desert plants, which ones could be made into a soothing tea and which ones were poison. He learned she hummed sometimes when she worked, a low, tuneless sound that was strangely comforting. She was not broken. She was resilient, a desert flower that had learned to bloom with very little water. One evening, as the sun bled its last colors across the horizon, they sat at the small table outside the cabin, sharing a simple meal of beans and the bread she had baked in a makeshift oven she had constructed from flat stones and clay. A comfortable silence stretched between them, punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. He had asked for her name twice, a simple act that had cost him almost everything and yet had given him something he hadn't known he was missing. He had sought to restore a piece of her dignity, and in doing so had found a piece of his own. She looked up from her plate, her clear blue eyes catching the last of the fading light. "Elias," she said, her voice soft. He met her gaze. "You never asked where I was from, or what they were doing with me." He considered her words for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said, "it's not my story to ask for." He had learned that some things, like a well-made saddle, were not defined by where they had been, but by the strength and integrity they carried forward. A small smile touched her lips, the first real smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Good," she said, "because it doesn't matter anymore." They finished their meal in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the vast, darkening sky. The world was still a hard and unforgiving place, but here, in this small pocket of dust and shade, two people who had been deemed worthless by the world had found a quiet sort of worth in each other. It was enough. It was everything. Thank you for being here, for staying with this story until the very end. We often measure a person's value by their title, their wealth, or the noise they make in the world. But sometimes, the truest measure of a person's worth is found in the quiet moments, in their resilience when no one is watching, in their capacity for kindness when it offers no reward. The world is full of people who have been dismissed, overlooked, or told they aren't worth introducing. But a name is not a label. It's a story. And every story deserves to be heard. My question for you is this: when was the last time you took a moment to truly see someone the world had taught you to ignore? Think about the value in that simple act of recognition. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you a moment of quiet reflection, we would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue crafting these stories for you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, be kind and look for the stories that hide in plain sight.